Can everybody hear me okay? How about now? Better?
Yeah.
Hi everyone. My name is Nanea and Renteria. I am faculty at San Francisco State University. And I just want to thank everyone who was here for the earlier session of student conversation. And I would invite you during our Q&A to hopefully share some of the reflections that were starting to emerge earlier on about how you feel and what you see as decolonizing the curriculum. So I'll try to keep my presentation relatively short to allow time for you folks to do that afterwards. So I want to just offer my gratitude to this space for the generosity of our hosts here at An-Najah, for Professor Abdul-Hadi, of course, and for our moderator, Tasneem. Also for the spirits of the power and legacies of resistance that reside in this place. That said, this paper is a question. It's an offering, it's an invitation, and it's also a work in progress. It's a geographic inquiry into the reaches of decolonial pedagogy as they manifest on stolen territory. In this case, where I teach San Francisco State University in California-occupied Ohlone territory. Similarly, I want to just offer this as a pedagogical and a spiritual question that concerns the ethics and the dilemmas of teaching about the earth as a displaced indigenous person on occupied territory. In the United States' first College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University, students in race, activism, and climate justice, that's the name of my course, examine and critically engage questions of indigenous sovereignty as they interface with contemporary problems of impending environmental catastrophe. The global stage is set as indigenous peoples and youth the world over make a series of political pushes for world leaders to respond to issues of climate and environmental justice through nothing less than radical systemic change. The world has watched as the United States rejects the Paris Agreement, pledges loyalty to coal-powered energy at the COP23, and pushes through invasive projects on indigenous territories such as the Dakota Access Pipeline. Worldwide, youth and indigenous peoples are at the forefront of earth-centered movements to defend the environment, address climate change, protect water, and create just, sustainable futures for all. In that vein, the course is an experiment in nurturing young people to become active, ethical, political agents in the struggle to defend life. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the unique situation at San Francisco State, using the kind of frame of power plus place equals personality, and I'll explain that in a moment. San Francisco State University stands on unceded Ohlone territory. Ohlone are the indigenous peoples of what's currently called the Bay Area of California. When the Spanish arrived to missionize indigenous peoples of Alta California in the 1700s, the Ohlone people already thrived in the greater Bay Area with well-developed systems of land use, management, and governance. As non-native guests in the Bay Area, we inherit a responsibility to listen to the people whose territories we occupy. How does a course designed as a site of decolonial praxis engage the history of the land upon which the classroom sits? What does it mean to teach about indigeneity as myself, a displaced indigenous person on occupied territory? It seems to me that the generative potential of the decolonial moment is limited by its location in a university setting, and that a teaching practice of radical listening can lay a groundwork to personalize students' relationship to the land they inhabit and their being as guests. So Vine Deloria is an American Indian author in the United States, and he writes that power is the living energy that inhabits and or composes the universe, and place is the relationship of things to each other. Together, these forces produce personality. San Francisco State is a place of contradiction, being home to the first College of Ethnic Studies in the nation, which, as was mentioned earlier, has roots in the Black Panther Party and Third World liberation struggles. Simultaneously, its power also functions as a machine of global mass production of Eurocentric fundamentalism. The people's movements that established the college were a response to the epistemicide of the Western University and community-based scholar activist struggles to decolonize the curriculum. Being accountable to this legacy means instructors attempt to realize the liberatory promise of ethnic studies. In my particular course, I attempt to do so by 1, identifying strategic practices of misinformation and contradicting them. So for example, what aspects of imperial history do most harm and which lies are at the foundations of our senses of ourselves. 2, making absences visible, i.e. writing Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, or for example, Palestinians out of the master narrative of history. 3, expanding our notions around what constitutes evidence, especially in the social sciences, so taking into account things like oral history, for example, given that most of what we want to know about hasn't been written about, physically written down. It often resides in oral histories and things of that nature. And 4, personalizing our relationship to the lands we occupy. So here's what the land in California tells me. The land now called California holds trauma, invasion, settlement, violence, and conquest. From the arrival of the Spanish, who used rape as a weapon of war, and later assimilation and the enforcement of hierarchy, to the founding of the mission system, which all elementary school students are still taught of as a benign project, the process of colonization proceeds from the land to the realm of epistemology, or the mind. Our heroes and holidays narrative that's taught in the K-12 school system, from ages 5 to roughly 18, praises and upholds the moral goodness and inevitability of settlement and conquest. The story of the land and its people are silenced. Strangled histories ache beneath our feet. Like vines, they creep into our homes and buttress our institutions. The way I understand it, being both indigenous and a guest in another's territory means being in personal relationship with forces seen and unseen, whose presence is felt in, on, and around the land. Inhabiting indigeneity in that context, for me, means to recalibrate what I accept as evidence and to teach others to learn from that place. So pedagogy for SF State students. Students in race, activism, and climate justice, or RRS 276, the name of my class, enter a classroom expecting to fulfill a bunch of general education requirements in one go. What they find instead is an introduction to the environmental impacts of neoliberalism, what we talked about earlier, and terra nullius, meaning empty land, in Indian country, and a weekly meditation on the epistemological roots of those problems in settler colonialism and Western modes of knowledge production that erase indigenous pasts and presents. Centering indigenous land struggles, specifically, we examine the narratives that are used to justify the treatment of native lands and bodies as sacrifice zones for economic exploitation and environmental degradation. The course is an attempt to bring students from a place of moral outrage, for example, thinking it's so awful what we did to those natives, to a space of understanding their relatedness and complicity with the land. What are my responsibilities to care for this place and my relatives here as a guest? Creating this space as a guest myself, a Yoeme native person who is not native to the land upon which I teach, is an experiment in radical listening to the land. Like any growth process, we begin by planting a seed. Deloria again writes that Indigenous educators in particular are better prepared and well suited by experience to critically look at the deep roots of Western-inspired institutions and practices. However, to begin that journey, students have to grasp how they arrived where they are, what forces, seen and unseen, past and present, helped or hindered their arrival in this seat, in this classroom, with each other, at this critical time. We have to talk about genealogy. We also have to talk about complicity, about land, and about ancestors. Who do you come from is one of the first questions posed to students in RRS 276, as they're forced to confront the ghosts discussed by Avery Gordon as social figures that conjure up a lingering past of injustices that have been made invisible in their heritages. By mid-semester, we're asking, what are the unique challenges faced by your peoples in relation to land, displacement, and natural resources? In other words, how can you come to see your heritage and struggle reflected in the case studies in this course? I just want to add a little caveat here that the vast majority of my students at San Francisco State do not recognize themselves as Indigenous, despite the fact that many of them are displaced Indigenous people, particularly Latinos, people from Mexico and Central America. So a major part of what I'm doing in the classroom is attempting to bring them to an understanding of themselves as displaced Indigenous peoples who share struggles with the Indigenous peoples of the United States who are then being forcibly removed through processes of neoliberalism and colonization. So in that vein, students have to learn to feel haunted by what they haven't learned about themselves. They have to come to an understanding of the ways that they read history as fundamentally flawed and colonized because of the fact that they don't understand themselves as Indigenous, despite I don't have time to totally get into it, but some of the processes of colonization in Mexico and the US functioned in part to not only displace indigenous peoples, but to, through racism, cause people to deny their link to indigeneity, despite the fact that to be Mexican is by definition to be part Spanish, part indigenous, and part African. So just to kind of offer you folks some context. In closing, I'll just say that every place, including this one, Palestine, is animated with a distinct power that fosters personal relationships to land and land struggles, and to those who protect it. The land where we put down roots already speaks to us by nurturing our bodies, minds, hearts, spirits, and struggles. When we're accountable to these forces, we cultivate reciprocal solidarities and interconnections that can begin to repair and challenge, in large and small ways, legacies of colonial violence. Similarly, I make this offering to you as a guest in your territory, knowing there's so much more to say, and with a prayer that the seeds we plant here can blossom into collaboration and budding relationships. From occupied Ohlone territory, we're shining light on the ways we benefit from displacement, even as we're displaced ourselves.
Thank you very much, Nanea. I'm just going to talk briefly in Arabic about what she said. So basically, Nanea talked about rooted pedagogies, which is الممارسات التربوية المرسخة. وتحدثت عن الممارسات التي تقوم بها بجامعة سان فرانسيسكو، كيف أنها تقوم بدعوة الطلاب لمعرفة أنفسهم، وخصوصا في التعرف على الشعوب الأخرى في مساق الدراسات العرقية اللي هو ethnic studies. Also, she said that she wants the course of ethnic studies to be like a climate. Yeah, basically I say the thing in English and then I say in Arabic so I can أبرمج حالي على العربي. Yes. كيف إنه يكون الدراسات العرقية أو الدعوة للعدالة هو عبارة عن مناخ، زي كيف هم بيعتنوا في البيئة وبيعتنوا في الماء، فتكون الاعتناء بالعدالة برضو إشي مشابه لهذا الحكي. حكت عن بعض المواقف في جامعة سان فرانسيسكو إنه كيف هم بيعملوا decolonizing للكوريكولم، أو كيف في contradiction، في تناقض، إنهم هم عندهم مساق الدراسات العرقية بس بنفس الوقت بيقيموا هذا الإشي من الكوريكولم، من المنهاج عندهم، ما بيكون في عندهم حكي عن الاستعمار أو حكي عن الأشياء اللي هي لها علاقة بالعدالة. فهي بتحاول قدر الإمكان في مساقاتها إنها تخلي الطلاب يتعرفوا على هاي الأشياء ويعرفوا من خلال حالهم، لأنه في عندهم كتير ناس سبانيش أو لاتين أمريكانز اللي هم صار معهم زينا، في عندهم اضطهاد، في عندهم فقر، أو هم indigenous people اللي هي الشعوب المعرضة للاضطهاد مثلنا، كيف إنهم يعرفوا إنه هذا الإشي هم فيهم، مش إنهم هم خلص أجوا على أمريكا وانولدوا فيها وهم زيهم زي الباقيين، لا هم لازم يتعرفوا على حالهم من خلال البيبل اللي حواليهم ويتعرفوا على الناس المشابهة لإلهم. So I hope that made the summary. Our next speaker is going to be Matshidiso. I hope that I said the name right. And the topic is going to be about teaching resistance, lessons from South Africa's alternative education project. So if we may.
I hope everyone's still awake after lunch. Leslie, I'm looking at you. My name is Matshidiso. I'm from an institution called the Afro-Middle East Center based in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm also a master's student at the University of Johannesburg, also in Johannesburg. That's where everything happens in South Africa. Today's talk that I'm going to speak to you about, hopefully be having an engaged conversation, very aware of time. Is to speak about South Africa's alternative education project, which is essentially the history of the South African anti-apartheid struggle. I'm also very aware that I stand here speaking to people that I share a very similar history in my context, but very much the present and the current situation of your everyday lives today. I always say before I start that Palestine and South Africa share very common histories. 1948 was a very imperative year in your lives. 1948 was also a very imperative year. in my life and the lives of my ancestors. But even before that, both contexts share an experience of colonialism in the form of British occupation, which was the same thing in South Africa, so I speak English so well. So South Africa's alternative education project was essentially a project adopted in the anti-apartheid struggle that started quite earlier on in the 1960s in terms of the conceptualization, but also going into the 1970s and 1980s as a response to the apartheid system, but also colonialism, which actually never ended, just got transcended into a more higher form of an apartheid system in South Africa. So the alternative education project sought to transcend and bring forth into a university educational space the social, political realities on the ground, in terms of, as Professor, Dr. Robin said to me yesterday, about breaking down the walls of the university, bringing in forth the struggles of, the social, political, and economic struggles on the ground into the formal education system, and what this meant in terms of resistance towards the apartheid system at the time in South Africa. But also this question of, what did education mean at the time and what does education mean today in South Africa, forms the basis on which I developed this paper. It's very important to think about education in two folds. In the context of the alternative education project, and education for liberation, as it was later called, was to essentially look at education as a tool of both oppression and a tool of liberation. What do I mean by a tool of oppression? Even today, we still have conversations about what are we taught, what is our history as a people. A lot of South African history is contextualized in speaking about our relationship to the occupation, to colonialism in our context, even today, after our liberation. I put that in quotation marks for a specific reason. I think I'm a radical, so that happens quite a lot to me. In terms of education as a tool for liberation, I speak about the deconstruction of what we have seen as traditional forms of education. What does that mean in the context of us resisting as a people and having the right to do so, but also thinking about it in the context of education. Earlier on there were conversations about how when we speak about our experiences and our relationship to the education system, especially the formal education system, we tend to divorce that from the socio-political realities that are on the ground. And the Education for Liberation project was to essentially link up all the struggles from moving just beyond the formal education system, thinking about how ordinary people that do not get into universities or get formal schooling, how do they have their learning process and how do they relate that to the broader resistance movement and essentially challenging the apartheid system that continues to dominate our lives and also integrate into so much of our everyday lives. And what does that mean as active beings that operate in the formal education system, and how do we bring in the realities on the ground? So how this happened during the anti-apartheid struggle, which continues even today in the South African formal education university system, is, for example, linking student struggles to worker struggles. The big thing around the past 2 years movement of Fees Must Fall was linking that to worker struggles, ending of outsourcing, speaking to unions, to trade unions on campus itself, speaking to cleaners that clean our toilets and bring us food, and how that gave us a reflection of the broader realities on the ground, and how when we get obsessed about looking at education as this formal system, we forget the realities that actually bring us in the university space in the first place. So the Education for Liberation project is essentially to do that. How do we use education as a tool to allow us to have the weapons against the occupation as a form of resistance? And how do we also not look at education as a structured formal system, but more of an everyday process that happens in every aspect of our lives? To make sure that I will take much of your time, I want to for us to think about how we've thought about traditionally the system of education and what that has meant for us going forward. How have we linked our own education, our own formal education, our own informal education to the broader conversations around resistance, the broader conversations around the economy, around the socio-political processes that continue to shape our lives and essentially a big integral part of our lives. I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you again for Matshidiso. So Matshidiso talks about teaching resistance اللي هي مقاومة التعليم وحكت عن دروس من أفريقيا الجنوبية وحكت عن المشروع البديل اللي هو للإديوكيشن. عرفت فيه عن كيف بيستخدموا الإديوكيشن as a tool for liberation اللي هي بيستخدموها كأداة للتحرير وكيف هم يعني بيعملوا deconstruction لهذا الإشي كيف بيحاولوا إنهم يقسموا هذا الإشي أو كيف بيعملوا تشالنج في الإديوكيشن عشان يوصلوا للتحرير. وبالنسبة كمان لأنه كيف يعني بتطلعوا على الإديوكيشن traditionally يعني بطريقة تقليدية بس بعدين بوصلوا للفكرة اللي هي الغير تقليدية عشان يصير في area للتحسن وللحصول على التحرير المطلوب. We are going to move to our next speaker, which is Daniela Pinto, and she's going to talk about Mapuche, Chile, and Diaspora politics, teaching justice, and teaching Palestine.
Hello. First of all, I want to say I'm really grateful to be here. I feel really honored to be able to do this presentation in front of the students in this university that's so famous and so important for Palestine. And I come from Chile, and I belong to the Palestinian Chilean community in Chile. We are between 300,000 and 500,000 people. We've been there since the beginnings of the 20th century. And it's a community that is originally formed by the people that escaped the Ottoman Empire. It's people that run away, and due to family ties, most of them come from Bet Jala, near Bethlehem in the south of Palestine. So most of us are Orthodox Christians, and there's like this really great feeling of attachment to Palestine, but in a way in which most of us have never actually been here. And Palestine, for many people in Chile, for the Palestinians in Chile, is this dream, but also this sort of impossibility. And now I've come to present you more about this situation and of the potentialities and of the possible futures that can emerge. Because finally, when Palestinians get to Chile, they get embedded, they get related to other sorts of histories. That's the history of Latin America, the history of colonization by Europe, the history of indigenous people, but also the history of the dictatorship in Chile, that particular history. So first, I'll try to be brief because I really want to hear from you, but I'll tell you that the Palestinian community in Chile is really well known, it's really important. We have the Palestinian Football Club. I don't know if you have heard of it. It's one of the most popular football clubs in Chile. It plays in first division, and it has got like widespread support throughout Chilean society. There's also the Center of Arab Studies in the Principal University of Chile. And there are many people, intellectuals, writers, include millionaires also, all types of people. And well, the Chilean case is really complex because first of all, you can't understand Chile if you don't understand that we lived 17 years of dictatorship from 1973 to 1990. And lots of people disappeared, some Palestinians also, But many other Palestinians, and this is a great contradiction, supported the dictatorship that killed the revolutionary movement. Huh? Oh, it's not working?
Keep going.
Oh,
Keep
okay.
going.
Yes, so that's really ironic. Lots of people disappeared. There were lots of violations to human rights. And there were also Palestinians fighting for the cause, socialists. But there were other people that were supportive of the regime, so that's not very good. And this dictatorship has been validated ultimately, and the violations to human rights have been recognized. The people that were killed have started appearing, so it's impossible to understand. So that it has been made possible to understand that violence in Chile was committed. But the only thing is that this erases the violence that had happened before and the violence that has happened afterwards. In this sense, the government has taken the official position that violence in Chile only existed during the dictatorship, when really we have people disappeared in democracy, or what they call democracy, but I would rather call post-dictatorship. And this in the wider context of the occupation and settler colonialism of the lands of the indigenous people from Chile, that's the Mapuche. The Mapuche people were really courageous people, really brave people, that they inhabited almost the whole of Chile, and with other indigenous people, of course. And when the Spanish came, they were unable to conquer them, so they recognized them as independent. But the thing is that when Chile recovers its independence, or gains its independence, it conquers the land of the indigenous people in the year 1880, introducing a regime of settler colonialism, dispossessing the people from their lands. People that had the whole of the territory now had 10% of their territory. They were taken to reductions. They were imposed in a regime that was racist, discriminatory, and that did not respect their rights. And that comes till this day. And when the Mapuche protest, they are criminalized. And this shows us how the Chilean state and the state in general has the difficulty to absorb difference, or to think itself within a framework that's different to a mono-national paradigm, as this in Chile. So we've had lots of Mapuche people disappear in democracy, shot in democracy. The Chilean state often enters the Mapuche communities and shoots the men, shoots the women, shoots the grandfathers, shoots the children. And this is really problematic. And this is a replication of what had already happened in dictatorship, when the leftists were also criminalized. And then you see these tactics, that is criminalization, that's something that's also used here in Palestine by Israel, to allow for violence against people that conflict the relations of the powerful. So within this context, the Chilean left wing and the Mapuche people have showed great signs of solidarity towards Palestine. Gladys Marin from the Communist Party, there's a great picture of her with a poster of Yasser Arafat saying that Chile supports Palestine. But the Palestinians in Chile, many of them belong to the right wing and have yet not seized these opportunities to have alliances with people that could further help Palestine. So instead of having allies within the left wing or with the Mapuche people that also support a lot the Palestinians, they publish things in favor of Palestine. That's always a good thing. But in the same newspaper that the right wing that disappeared people during dictatorship uses. That's El Mercurio. El Mercurio is a newspaper that was used to cover the deaths of the left-wing militants. So this is a really conflictive relationship. Even though now with the appearance of the BDS movement, the Palestinian Chilean youth has been using this and has been establishing wider relationships with other movements. And there's a really strong sense of commitment and of wanting to advance the Palestinian cause in Chile. And there have been great advances, especially the joining of anti-Zionist Jewish people working in favor of Palestine in Chile. And so I wanted to invite you to think on this situation. There are lots of people that want to support Palestine in Chile, and I really want to discuss what are the possibilities of what can be done in this room, especially with the student movements also. And I want to finish reading a declaration that was issued by the Meli Witran Mapu. That's one of the most important Mapuche organizations in Chile, in support of Palestine. This was in support of an attack that had happened in Gaza. As Mapuche, we solidarize with the Palestinian people, as we consider their resistance is fair and just, as they are an example for the world in their legitimate fight to recover their self-determination, dispossessed by Israel and the powers servile to the imperialism of the US, and the systematic violence that the terrorism of the Zionist state inflicts on the Palestinian nation. We send a warm and humanitarian greeting to the Palestinians and their organization, because both of us resist colonialism and we deny the possibility of disappearing. With conviction, we fight to exercise our right to self-determination, to decide over our future and the territory we have occupied historically. Long life to solidarity between peoples in resistance. Down with Israel, the Israeli military occupation, and freedom to Palestine.
Thank you very much, Daniela. It was a very interesting topic. دانييلا حكت عن شعب المابيتشو والتشيلي والدايسبورا الشتات، سياسة الشتات، وحكت أهم إشي عن المجتمعات الفلسطينية التشيلية، وحكت إنه في مجموعة كبيرة من الفلسطينيين في تشيلي، وخصوصا إنهم بدعموا القضية الفلسطينية. في كتير برضو من الكوميونيتي الفلسطيني، المجتمع الفلسطيني اللي في تشيلي منهم مفكرين، كتاب، في كتير منهم برضو فوتبول كلوبس اللي هي الكرات القدم، مجتمعات كرات القدم. حكت برضو عن تاريخ الشعب التشيلي وكيف كان مضطهد من قبل الإسبان وكيف كان مضطهد من قبل الشعب المابيتشو. بس بالرغم من ذلك التشيليين قرروا إنهم يعملوا مقاومة لهذا الرجيم وما يخلوه يأثر فيهم. وكمان الشعب التشيلي مصر على التضامن مع الفلسطينيين، وحبوا يوصلوا رسالة للفلسطينيين إنهم هم متضامنين معهم، هم دائما بيحكوا لهم إنهم المقاومة تبعتهم هي عبارة عن